Welcome to the mysterious casebook. Tonight, a brilliant mind, Miss Marple, faces a chilling puzzle. The testament of the chessboard merchant. Secrets lie in a forgotten chessboard, and every move could reveal betrayal. Light a candle, settle in, and let the mystery begin. Where are you listening from tonight? Perhaps from a snug chair beside a flickering lamp, or in a quiet corner with a cup of tea in hand. Imagine, if you will, the little village of Hatherley, its streets cobbled and narrow, lined with honey-colored cottages, where the ordinary rhythm of life is rarely disturbed. That evening, however, a peculiar unease had settled over the town, like a shadow creeping over sunlit lawns. It began at the Bluebell Inn, where villagers gathered for the weekly supper. Mrs. Pritchard, the inn's hostess, bustled about with a smile that strained at the edges. "You'll excuse the late news," she announced to her regulars, "but Mr. Lawrence—" "Yes, the chessboard merchant from London has arrived unexpectedly, and he looks quite distressed." Miss Marple, who had taken her usual corner by the window, knitting needles poised and eyes sharp as ever, noticed the stir immediately. The room seemed suddenly smaller, heavier. Conversations ceased mid-word, and glasses halted mid-air. A hush fell as the merchant entered, a tall man, neatly attired yet pale, clutching a leather case as if it contained not goods, but secrets. "Good evening," he said, voice low, yet tinged with urgency. "I require someone's assistance." The villagers exchanged curious glances. Mr. Lawrence was known for his meticulous manner and his passion for rare chessboards, each handcrafted and priceless. Yet tonight there was a tremor in his hands, a fleeting shadow of fear in his eyes. Miss Marple, though outwardly calm, observed every detail. The slight tremor, the angle of his hat shadowing his brow, and the way he hesitated before stepping fully inside were whispers of unease that spoke louder than words. "What sort of assistance do you need?" asked the vicar, a tall man whose collar had a tendency to slip. Lawrence lowered his case to the floor and tapped it lightly. "I've inherited a business matter from a late associate. There is a will, a chessboard inlaid with an unusual pattern, and certain complications that I cannot explain." He glanced around as though wary of invisible eyes listening. A murmur ran through the room. "A chessboard will?" asked young Mrs. Aldridge, leaning forward. "How intriguing." "Yes," said Lawrence. "But there are tensions, people who should not know certain details, yet seem oddly aware, and I fear for my safety, if I am entirely candid." Here, Miss Marple's attention sharpened. Fear was rarely spontaneous. It was cultivated or forced by circumstance. A person genuinely fearful would not announce it with theatrical pauses. Yet there was truth in his unease. His posture betrayed it, his eyes flicking toward the doorway every few seconds, as if expecting someone or something. Before anyone could respond, the inn door swung open abruptly, and a strong wind sent a scattering of autumn leaves across the floor. A man entered, cloaked in a dark coat, and paused near the fireplace. No introductions, no greetings, only a cold, assessing glance that seemed to settle on Mr. Lawrence. A hush descended again. Miss Marple's knitting needles are still. There was a tension, subtle yet undeniable, vibrating like a taut wire in the air. The visitor did not speak, only watched, and the villagers instinctively stepped back, leaving space that seemed almost ceremonial. Lawrence's hand tightened on his case. "I had not expected you so soon," he said, though the tone was more a warning than surprise. The stranger's eyes did not shift. He merely said, "Business is rarely patient, Mr. Lawrence, and some matters cannot be left unattended." The sound of that voice was like gravel over china, hard, deliberate, and with an undercurrent of menace. Miss Marple's mind began piecing together details, invisible threads connecting the man's sudden arrival, the cryptic mention of a chessboard, and Lawrence's tremor. Something, she thought, had been set in motion, and not by chance. Dinner was hastily concluded. Villagers offered polite but distracted conversation, each sentence a careful probe rather than a natural exchange. Lawrence, clearly uncomfortable, excused himself early and retired to his room above the inn, leaving the mysterious man by the hearth. Miss Marple lingered by the window, her knitting forgotten. The flickering candlelight danced across the chessboard illustration on Lawrence's case, and her mind turned over the possibilities. Who could have been following the merchant? What secrets did that chessboard hold? And why, she wondered, did fear cling to Mr. Lawrence as a shadow does to dusk? Just as the clock in the inn struck 10, a sharp, echoing scream shattered the quiet of the village streets. Windows rattled, a dog barked somewhere, and the villagers froze in place, straining to identify the source. Miss Marple, with her keen village intuition, did not move immediately. Instead, she listened to the nuances of the scream, the hesitation in its echo. It was not a cry of panic alone. It carried a certain calculation, a warning perhaps, or a lure. And there, in the silence that followed, she understood that this night, ordinary no longer, would not end quietly. A shadow had fallen over Hatherley, and already the first piece of the deadly puzzle had moved. Stay with us until the end. Only then will the truth be revealed. The morning after the strange arrival at the Bluebell Inn was heavy with fog, clinging to the cobblestones and curling around the chimneys of Hatherley like a whispered secret. Miss Marple, her knitting basket balanced carefully on her lap, stepped out into the chill, her eyes narrowing as she took in the village square. The usually serene streets were punctuated with hasty footsteps, half-whispered conversations, and the occasional sharp intake of breath that betrayed nerves fraying at the edges. Something had unsettled the town, though exactly what it was remained tantalizingly elusive. "Have you heard about Mr. Lawrence?" Mrs. Pritchard asked, appearing beside Miss Marple, her apron dusted with flour from an early baking session. "He barely slept last night, and that visitor, I don't know what to make of him. He just stood there, like a shadow, watching." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly, her eyes sweeping the street. "A shadow can conceal many things, Mrs. Pritchard. Sometimes it is the shadow itself that tells the truth. People who watch so intently usually fear discovery themselves." The innkeeper's eyes widened, betraying a mix of curiosity and mild alarm. "You think there's trouble?" "Not necessarily trouble, but certainly tension," Miss Marple said calmly. "Hatherley is too small for secrets to remain hidden for long. Someone will speak, if only in the wrong company." By mid-morning, the village square had become a gentle hub of speculation. Shopkeepers leaned out of doors, adjusting signs or wiping counters, but their attention was never far from the talk at the inn. Mrs. Aldridge, ever eager for news, whispered to a neighbor about the late-night scream and the mystery visitor. Each retelling added new flourishes: the man's height, the glint of his eyes, and the ominous air surrounding Mr. Lawrence's leather case. In the midst of this, Miss Marple strolled slowly past the square, making deliberate observations. A half-open window, a hastily discarded scarf, and a footprint pressed into the morning forest were small details that might be overlooked by a casual observer, but to her, each was a thread she could follow. By 11 o'clock, Lawrence appeared at the door of the Bluebell Inn, his expression a mixture of determination and unease. He carried the leather case once more, though with greater care, as if it contained the delicate balance of his world. Miss Marple, approaching casually, asked, "Did the visitor depart early this morning?" Lawrence shook his head. "Number. He remained. I only saw him once at dawn, standing silently near the hearth. I do not know his intentions, nor why he is so invested in this matter." "A mystery lingers, then," Miss Marple said softly, "and mysteries have a tendency to speak to those who listen. At that moment, young Peter Aldridge came running down the lane, breathless and excited. "Miss Marple." "Did you hear? The constable is asking questions about the scream. He's going to see if anyone noticed anything unusual indeed," Miss Marple replied, her voice calm but her mind alert. "And what do you suppose might be unusual in Hatherley at this hour?" Peter hesitated, blinking against the fog. "Well, people were whispering. Some said it sounded like a woman. Others said—" He stopped abruptly, sensing her scrutiny. "Others?" Miss Marple prompted gently, giving him a nod of encouragement. "Others thought it was a warning, that maybe someone was being threatened." He shivered, both from the cold and the intensity of the speculation. Miss Marple's lips pursed faintly. "Fear often amplifies sounds, Peter, but it can also reveal truths that calm ears might miss." She gave him a small, reassuring smile before continuing her walk toward the inn, aware that the merchant might need guidance, even if he did not know it yet. Inside the Bluebell Inn, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Mrs. Pritchard fussed over teacups while villagers speculated freely about the night's events. Lawrence stood apart, fidgeting with the leather case, his eyes darting nervously toward the door. "I don't understand," Mrs. Aldridge said, leaning toward him, voice low. "Why would anyone want to threaten you? You're a chess merchant. Surely you sell boards, not trouble." Lawrence's face clouded. But a chessboard can conceal much more than a mere pattern of squares. The one in question belonged to my late associate. Its inlay is unique, its history valuable, perhaps too valuable for comfort, and there are those who might believe it contains more than just artistry. Miss Marple listened quietly, her fingers tapping the edge of her knitting basket. Something in his phrasing, a hesitation, a subtle tension, caught her attention. He spoke the words, "more than just artistry," with a care that suggested an unspoken truth. The inn door creaked open, and the mysterious visitor appeared once again. He did not speak but scanned the room, his gaze finally settling on Lawrence. The merchant's hand twitched slightly, betraying his anxiety, while the villagers murmured in curiosity and unease. Miss Marple, moving to the side, observed closely. The visitor's presence was deliberate, precise, and unnerving. Yet it was not brute force that frightened. It was the weight of watchfulness, the unyielding attention paid to a man who had little chance to defend himself against observation alone. Lunch passed with careful politeness, punctuated by stolen glances and whispered conjectures. Villagers speculated in low tones, each sentence carrying half-truths and carefully concealed embellishments. Miss Marple noted each, storing them for later reflection. It was remarkable how easily the human tongue betrayed a mind's secret, if one only listened. As afternoon waned, Miss Marple took her leave to wander the village once more, returning to the inn in time to see Lawrence stepping out with the leather case, heading toward a secluded lane behind the cottages. Curiosity drove her, but so did instinct. She followed at a discreet distance, noting the crunch of frost underfoot and the slight rustle of fabric as the merchant's coat caught on a branch. Suddenly, a soft metallic sound reached her ears, a brief, almost dismissible note of something dropped. Miss Marple paused, eyes narrowing. Lawrence had stopped, glancing around as though aware that something was amiss. He bent briefly, retrieving a small, ornate key from the ground, its intricate designs catching the weak sunlight. Her heart quickened. A clue, almost imperceptible to anyone else, and yet significant. Who had dropped it? Was it Lawrence himself, or had it fallen from another hand? The key was old, its workmanship exquisite, hinting at a secret locked away, perhaps within the very chessboard he carried. Miss Marple tucked the detail into her mind like a thread in a tapestry, waiting for its relevance to reveal itself. She knew, as she watched Lawrence disappear into the fog, that the web of Hatherley was tightening and that the first threads of suspicion had already begun to intertwine. By evening, whispers had turned to murmurs of alarm. A package had been left at the inn for Lawrence, its contents unknown. No note accompanied it, yet the envelope was sealed with a crimson wax stamp bearing a symbol that even Miss Marple did not immediately recognize. She made a mental note that curiosity was a reliable companion, as were questions. And just as the village prepared for supper, a sudden crash echoed from Lawrence's room above the inn. Voices rose in panic. Footsteps hurried. Miss Marple, knitting abandoned at her side, paused at the top of the stairs, listening carefully to the commotion. Someone had entered unexpectedly, perhaps deliberately. Hatherley, calm no longer, had been fully drawn into a game of secrets and suspicion. And the first subtle clue, the key, would be the first of many to unravel the truth. Stay with us, for the pieces of this delicate and dangerous puzzle are only beginning to move. The following morning brought a brittle clarity to Hatherley, frost glittering like tiny diamonds across window panes and garden hedges. Miss Marple, ever punctual, had settled into her favorite chair by the parlor window, tea steaming in a delicate china cup, when the inn's bell clanged insistently. She set down her cup with a faint smile, noting the crispness of the visitor's footsteps. Hatherley may have been a village of familiar routines, but the past 2 days had shown that even the most ordinary streets could host extraordinary events. Lawrence emerged into the parlor, carrying his leather case with the same careful precision as before, but there was an edge to his movements that suggested unease beyond mere concern for his possessions. His eyes darted toward the window, catching Miss Marple's gaze with an expression that was part plea, part confession. "Good morning, Mr. Lawrence," she said warmly, inclining her head. "The village is particularly brisk today, wouldn't you agree?" Lawrence offered a tight-lipped smile. "Yes, brisk and full of surprises. I fear the disturbances of yesterday may not have ended with the evening." Miss Marple's fingers tapped lightly on her teacup. Disturbances have a way of following certain people, particularly those who carry secrets with them. Her tone was casual, but her eyes held a quiet intensity. Before Lawrence could respond, a sudden knock at the inn's door announced another presence. Mrs. Pritchard opened it with a flourish, revealing a tall man in a charcoal coat and a wide-brimmed hat, a letter clutched in his hand. "Delivery for Mr. Lawrence," he said in a clipped voice, handing over the envelope sealed with crimson, which had the same symbol as the mysterious package from the previous evening. Lawrence's hand trembled slightly as he accepted it. I did not expect his words faltered, and he turned the letter over, inspecting the seal with obvious concern. Miss Marple leaned forward, voice soft but deliberate. "Curious, isn't it, how certain symbols appear repeatedly, seemingly mundane yet heavy with intent? The human mind tends to assign significance, even when none is apparent." The inn had grown quiet. Villagers who had gathered for morning errands now watched with subtle fascination, whispering to one another. There was a collective sense of tension, as though everyone were waiting for some invisible cue. Lawrence broke the seal carefully and unfolded the letter, his eyes scanning rapidly. Miss Marple noticed the momentary flash of alarm and the way his grip tightened on the paper. "It seems our game grows more intricate," he murmured. A murmur ran through the inn. Mrs. Aldridge, curious as ever, asked, "Mr. Lawrence, what does it say?" "Is it a threat?" He shook his head. "Not a threat, exactly. Instructions, more than warnings." "It is puzzling." Miss Marple observed the exchange quietly, her mind parsing the layers of emotion, the subtle clues that might escape others. The merchant's concern was genuine, but there was also hesitation, a fraction of hesitation that suggested knowledge unspoken, a detail left carefully concealed. No sooner had Lawrence set the letter aside than the door opened again, this time to admit the inn's usual postman, who delivered a small parcel wrapped in plain brown paper. Curiously, there was no name, no indication of origin. He shrugged and left, leaving the parcel on the counter. Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the package. So the puzzle deepens, she murmured under her breath. The key she had observed the day before now seemed to take on a greater significance. Lawrence, after a moment of indecision, opened the parcel. Inside was a miniature chessboard, exquisitely crafted, with the inlaid pieces resting in their positions. But upon closer inspection, Miss Marple noticed a slight irregularity at a tiny mark etched into the underside of the board, a symbol that echoed the crimson seal. The inn was silent. Every eye was drawn to the chessboard, though none but Miss Marple discerned the subtle code hidden in plain sight. She made a mental note that such marks were seldom idle, and more often than not, they concealed messages meant for particular eyes alone. As Lawrence handled the board with reverence and a touch of fear, a sudden disturbance arose near the door. A stranger had appeared, leaning casually against the frame of a man whose presence had been unnoticed until this precise moment. His gaze swept across the room, resting on Lawrence with deliberate scrutiny. Miss Marple, unfazed, studied him carefully. There was nothing overtly menacing in his posture, but subtle cues in the set of his shoulders, the calculated pause before speaking, and the glint of his watch catching the morning light spoke volumes. This man had a purpose. "Good morning," the stranger said smoothly, voice low and measured. "I believe we have mutual interests in the merchant's possessions." Lawrence stiffened, eyes narrowing. "I do not know you. You have no business here." The stranger smiled faintly, as if amused by the protest. "On the contrary, I believe I have every right. Matters concerning this board and the recent occurrences require attention." Miss Marple interjected quietly, almost to herself but with sufficient volume for all to hear. Attention can be a gentle matter, or it can be a hammer-striking stone. The manner in which one seeks information is as revealing as the knowledge itself. The stranger's eyes flicked to her, briefly calculating before settling back on Lawrence. "Ah, a third party. I should not be surprised in Hatherley. Small villages have long memories." His presence unnerved the villagers. Mrs. Pritchard fussed with tea, hands trembling slightly. Lawrence, meanwhile, struggled to regain composure, though Miss Marple could see the strain in the tightening lines of his face. "Perhaps a discussion in private would be preferable," Lawrence said, voice strained. He gestured toward the side parlor. The stranger inclined his head with quiet civility and followed, leaving a trail of uneasy murmurs in his wake. Miss Marple lingered in the main room, knitting basket in hand, observing the ripple of reactions. Each villager's expression revealed tiny secrets, curiosity, fear, suspicion, and the ever-present thrill of gossip. She made silent mental notes of each, for all these whispers were pieces of the greater puzzle. As the afternoon waned, a small shadow moved near the back window. Miss Marple noticed it almost instinctively, a hand slipping a folded note beneath the sill. She retrieved it cautiously, opening it to find a cryptic message. "The board is more than it seems. Watch the pieces closely, or the next move will be your last." Her heart quickened, not from fear, but from recognition. The game was beginning in earnest, and the pieces, both human and carved, were set upon the board with deliberate intent. The village's ordinary calm was now irreversibly fractured, each step forward a step into a labyrinth of secrecy and danger. Even as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, casting long shadows across Hatherley, Miss Marple's mind worked steadily, tracing connections, observing gestures, and recording truths hidden within lies. The uninvited guest had arrived, the letter and chessboard had spoken, and the first real strands of the mystery were beginning to tighten around them all. Stay close, dear listener, for the next move may come from the least expected player, and the shadow of suspicion grows longer with every passing hour. The morning after the uninvited visitor's arrival, Hatherley seemed quieter than usual, though the hush was heavy with unspoken curiosity. Miss Marple, seated by the parlour window with her knitting, noted the unusual stillness as she watched the villagers go about their routines. Even the bakery, normally bursting with gossip and the scent of freshly baked bread, had a subdued atmosphere. It was as though the chessboard and the stranger's sudden appearance had cast a shadow over the village, leaving a trace of unease in every glance exchanged on the street. Her observations were interrupted by the soft creak of the inn's door. Lawrence entered, carrying the chessboard with exaggerated care, as if it were a fragile treasure rather than an ordinary object. His usual composure seemed strained, a fact not lost on Miss Marple, who had long perfected the art of reading human tension. "Good morning, Mr. Lawrence," she greeted him. "It seems even the sun hesitates to shine when mysteries linger in the air." Lawrence offered a faint smile, setting the board down carefully on a side table. "I find that Hatherley's residents are remarkably observant, Miss Marple, or perhaps they are simply inclined to notice the unusual." Miss Marple nodded, a small twinkle in her eye. "Observant, yes. But it is what they overlook that often matters most. The subtle slip, the hesitation in speech, or a glance that betrays thought unspoken, all of these speak louder than words." Before Lawrence could respond, a tap sounded at the parlour window. Miss Marple turned her head, noting a small figure standing just outside, face partially obscured by a scarf. She recognized the young apprentice from the village post office, clutching a folded note. "Miss Marple." "For you," the boy called, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. She took the note gingerly, carefully unfolding it. The handwriting was sharp and hurried, the message terse. "Trust no one entirely. The chessboard watches, and the moves have begun. Tonight, all will be revealed." Miss Marple's lips pressed together in a faint line. "Ah," she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. The note's urgency hinted at fear, but also knowledge that some were unwilling to share openly. There was intent here, a deliberate attempt to stir attention and, perhaps, provoke action. Lawrence leaned closer, curiosity flickering across his face. "Do you understand it?" "Partly," Miss Marple replied, her voice soft yet deliberate. "It is meant to alarm, certainly. But the phrasing suggests someone expects an audience, someone who observes quietly before acting. That, my dear Mr. Lawrence, is where the true clue lies." A sudden knock at the inn's main door drew their attention. Mrs. Pritchard bustled forward, opening it to reveal Mrs. Aldridge, her expression a mix of concern and barely contained excitement. "Good morning," she began, voice tight. "I hope I'm not intruding, but I could not help hearing about the events of yesterday. I thought perhaps you might allow me a moment to discuss." She gestured vaguely toward the chessboard. Miss Marple inclined her head politely. "Of course, Mrs. Aldridge. Hatherley thrives on conversation, does it not?" The three of them gathered around the chessboard. Mrs. Aldridge leaned close to examine it, her eyes narrowing at the etched symbol beneath. "What on earth is that?" she asked. "A mark of intent," Miss Marple said gently, lifting a piece to reveal the subtle carving. "It is easy to overlook, yet it speaks volumes to those who know what to look for. In this village, as in life, it is often the small details that reveal the greatest truths." Mrs. Aldridge murmured something under her breath, a faint suggestion of worry that Lawrence did not miss. His hand paused mid-air, holding a chess piece, as though he had suddenly become aware that each move carried weight far beyond the simple game. Outside the window, shadows lengthened, and the faint whisper of voices drifted from the street below. Miss Marple's attention shifted, noting the way a small group of villagers lingered just out of sight, their gazes darting toward the inn. It was clear that the chessboard and the previous day's visitor had ignited speculation, though none of these observers could fully comprehend the underlying danger. "Have you noticed," Miss Marple said, her tone casual but pointed, "that people often reveal more than they intend simply by their manner of observing? The anxious glance and the hurried retreat are clues in plain sight, if one only pays attention." Lawrence followed her gaze, eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "I had not considered that the villagers themselves might provide insight." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied. "One's neighbors can be as instructive as the letters or parcels that arrive unexpectedly. In fact, sometimes more so, for they are unguarded in ways that letters never are." The afternoon waned, bringing with it a subtle chill. Miss Marple rose from her chair, smoothing her skirt, and glanced at the chessboard once more. The pieces seemed ordinary, yet the weight of unseen meaning hung between them. Each carving, each movement hinted at strategy, rivalry, and a message intended for very particular eyes. Just as she turned to pour herself another cup of tea, a loud crash from the back room startled everyone. Mrs. Pritchard gasped, Lawrence flinched, and Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. She moved swiftly to the source, discovering that a stack of ledgers had toppled, scattering pages across the floor. Among the scattered papers lay a single chess piece, its polished surface reflecting the dim light of a night, positioned strangely as if deliberately placed. Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "So," she said softly, "the game is becoming more animated. Each move, each gesture, brings us closer to uncovering what lies beneath the surface." She picked up the knight, turning it over to study the minute scratches along its base. They were subtle, almost imperceptible, yet unmistakable to a trained eye. The message was clear. Someone was watching, maneuvering, and perhaps waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As the villagers outside whispered and wondered what was unfolding, Miss Marple stood quietly by the window, her mind tracing possibilities, motives, and the delicate threads connecting each subtle act. In Hatherley, as elsewhere, the quietest moments often concealed the loudest truths, and she intended to hear every word, see every glance, and notice every move. Stay with us, dear listener, for the shadows are lengthening, and the next revelation may arrive from the most unexpected corner of the village. The morning sun filtered weakly through the thin curtains of Miss Marple's sitting room, casting a pale light over her carefully arranged collection of village sketches and knitting supplies. She sipped her tea slowly, her mind occupied with the events that had begun to unravel in Hatherley. Each encounter, each whispered word, and each careful glance outside the window seemed connected, yet the pattern remained elusive. The chessboard, resting solemnly on her side table, seemed almost to hum with secrets waiting to be discovered. A knock at the door drew her attention. It was Mr. Lawrence, who entered with his usual cautious step, though his brow was furrowed with unease. "Good morning, Miss Marple. I fear the village is stirring more than ever. People are asking questions, unwelcome ones, I might add." Miss Marple inclined her head, setting her cup down. "Questions are natural, Mr. Lawrence. Curiosity is the first step toward discovery, though it can also be the first step toward panic. Tell me, what have you observed this morning?" Lawrence hesitated, then spoke quietly. "I noticed Mrs. Aldridge speaking with Mrs. Pritchard near the market square. Their conversation was low, but I caught the words chessboard and danger. It seemed conspiratorial." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Conspiratorial, you say? And yet it is possible they meant only to protect one another from unnecessary alarm, but one cannot ignore such coincidences. Thank you, Mr. Lawrence." As he left, Miss Marple's attention shifted to the window. Across the street, the village grocer was speaking in hushed tones to a small group of neighbors. Their gestures were subtle but pointed, suggesting that gossip, like water, found every crack in the village's facade. Miss Marple's lips pressed into a thin line. People often reveal more than they intend when they believe no one is listening. Her contemplation was interrupted by the soft tinkle of the doorbell. She rose and opened the door to find young Eleanor Price, the post office apprentice, clutching a small envelope. "Miss Marple, I found this tucked behind a book at the inn," she whispered, handing it over. Carefully opening the envelope, Miss Marple discovered a note written in a hurried, almost frantic hand. "He watches from the shadows. Trust no one completely. The next move will come before dusk." She read it twice, then folded it with deliberate care. The timing was curious. "Eleanor, did anyone see you deliver this?" she asked. The girl shook her head. "No, ma'am. I slipped it in quietly, as instructed. But I swear I heard someone moving in the alley behind the inn just before I came here." Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the alley outside. "Indeed. Then we must consider not only what is written, but also who wishes it to be found. The delivery itself is part of the message. Someone intends for this warning to be received, and we must ask why." She walked over to the chessboard, inspecting the arrangement of pieces with renewed interest. The knight that had been mysteriously placed yesterday remained on the same square, as if frozen in anticipation. Miss Marple leaned closer, noting the fine scratches along its base. Each mark seemed deliberate, a message encoded in subtle detail. A sudden knock at the parlor door startled her. She opened it to find Dr. Sinclair, the village physician, looked unusually grave. "Miss Marple, forgive my intrusion," he said, stepping inside. "But I must speak with you. It concerns Mr. Aldridge that he has fallen ill under suspicious circumstances." Miss Marple gestured for him to continue. "Suspicious, you say? In what way?" Dr. Sinclair glanced around before lowering his voice. "He experienced sudden weakness last night, and I found a faint residue on his drink. I cannot confirm its nature, but it is highly irregular. Given the recent tensions, I felt you should know immediately." Miss Marple's mind raced. The chessboard, the stranger's visit, and the mysterious notes are all now intertwined with a tangible threat. She considered the villagers' recent behaviors, the furtive glances, the whispered conversations, and the subtle discrepancies she had noted. Everything pointed toward a carefully orchestrated plan, though the ultimate aim remained obscured. "Thank you, Dr. Sinclair," she said softly. "I shall keep this information in mind. Timing, method, and opportunity, these are the three strands we must untangle." As he left, Miss Marple returned to her seat by the window. The street outside had become a river of movement, villagers drifting like shadows, each carrying their own piece of knowledge, rumor, or fear. She picked up her knitting and worked steadily, letting her mind trace every thread of possibility. Then, a sudden cry echoed from the market square. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and stepped to the window, heart quickening. A small crowd had gathered, pointing toward a figure lying sprawled near the fountain. Murmurs of shock and speculation swirled like autumn leaves caught in the wind. Without a word, Miss Marple grabbed her coat and hat, moving toward the commotion. Each step was measured, each glance purposeful. In Hatherley, as she knew well, appearances were deceptive, and the smallest gesture often concealed the deepest intentions. As she approached the crowd, she caught sight of the fallen figure, a young man, pale and trembling, his eyes wide with fright rather than injury. Clutched in his hand was another chess piece, a bishop this time, marked with the same subtle scratches she had noted before. Miss Marple bent closer, whispering to herself, "So the game truly begins, and the players are revealing themselves, one by one." The villagers parted reluctantly, leaving her standing over the boy as he murmured, "It told me to bring it, or something would happen." She straightened, scanning the square and the anxious faces surrounding them. Each person's expression betrayed a mixture of curiosity, fear, and secrecy. And in that moment, Miss Marple realized that Hatherley itself had become a chessboard, its inhabitants pieces in a game far larger and far more perilous than they could imagine. Stay with us, dear listener, for the next move is imminent, and the shadows are shifting faster than anyone can see. The village square was unusually tense that afternoon, the usual clatter of carts and chatter of market-goers muted by the lingering shock of the morning's incident. Miss Marple strolled slowly among the crowd, her sharp eyes catching every subtle shift of expression, every hurried glance, and every whispered conversation that might reveal more than the speakers intended. She noted the way Mrs. Pritchard fidgeted with her gloves, avoiding direct eye contact with the young man who had collapsed earlier, and the way Mr. Clark, the innkeeper, seemed to edge toward the fountain, as if trying to appear casual while clearly watching for someone or something. "Miss Marple," came a nervous voice. It was young Eleanor Price again, clutching the letter she had delivered the day before. "I think someone's following me when I leave the post office. I saw a shadow on the corner by the bakery." Miss Marple nodded, keeping her tone calm. "And did you notice anything about the shadow? Clothing, height, gait?" Eleanor hesitated. "I couldn't see clearly, ma'am, but it moved in a peculiar way, like it was watching me carefully." "That is useful," Miss Marple said softly. "A shadow that watches is often a piece in a game. And you, my dear, have unwittingly moved that piece." Eleanor's eyes widened. "Do you think it is dangerous, Miss Marple?" "Possibly," she replied, her gaze sweeping the square once more. "But danger, like curiosity, is often only a matter of perception. Pay attention, my dear, and observe without fear." Miss Marple moved toward the fountain, where the young man had collapsed. He was seated on a bench, still clutching the scratched bishop, his pale face now flushed with a mixture of fright and embarrassment. "And how do you feel now?" she asked gently. "I don't know, ma'am. I just found the bishop on the windowsill of the inn, and then it told me I had to bring it here." His voice trembled with the weight of confusion and fear. Miss Marple took a careful look at the chess piece. "You say it told you. Do you mean someone instructed you to carry it, or do you mean something else?" The boy shook his head. "I don't know if it felt like it had a will of its own." She allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. Chess, like life, can feel that way when the players are unaware of the rules, and someone wishes for you to follow them, whether you realize it or not. From across the square, Miss Marple spotted Mrs. Aldridge, speaking in hushed tones with a stranger near the edge of the market stalls. Their movements were careful, almost deliberate, suggesting they did not wish to be overheard. Miss Marple's mind began to piece together the fragments she had observed: the mysterious letters, the altered chessboard, the sudden illness of Mr. Aldridge, and the whispered warnings, all pointing to a series of carefully placed maneuvers. A sudden argument broke out nearby. Mr. Clark was confronting a villager who had accused him of hiding something during the morning commotion. The man gestured wildly, his face red with frustration, while Clark's hands trembled as he tried to maintain composure. Miss Marple noted how often such displays of irritation concealed more than they revealed. "Miss Marple," a familiar voice called. Dr. Sinclair approached, looking slightly flustered. "I need to discuss something with you. It concerns the residue I mentioned on Mr. Aldridge's drink." She nodded, giving him a moment to catch his breath. "Please, go on." Dr. Sinclair glanced around, lowering his voice. "I examined a small sample and found traces consistent with a sedative, though I cannot confirm the exact substance. My concern is the timing. It coincides almost exactly with the delivery of the note to your house. It seems too precise to be a coincidence." Miss Marple's brow furrowed slightly. "Precision, indeed, often speaks louder than intention, Doctor Sinclair. And in Hatherley, where each person's habits are so well known, a sudden deviation is never without meaning." She allowed herself a quiet moment to observe the square once more. Children darted between the stalls, unaware of the adult tension, while shopkeepers exchanged brief, guarded glances. Somewhere in the crowd, a plan was unfolding, and Miss Marple was determined to understand it before another mishap occurred. Her attention returned to the young man with the bishop. "You must be careful with whom you speak," she advised. "Even those who seem trustworthy may have motives that are not immediately visible. And remember, every move you make is watched, just as every move you observe can reveal the truth." A sudden scream drew Miss Marple's gaze toward the bakery. A woman had collapsed, clutching her chest, while a small crowd rushed to assist. Miss Marple felt a familiar twinge of concern and curiosity. The pattern was growing clearer. These were not isolated incidents, but part of a deliberate sequence. She approached the scene with measured steps, her mind already cataloguing the potential clues. The woman's distress, though serious, did not appear fatal, but it added urgency to the unfolding situation. Every villager, every gesture, and every whisper now carried significance in the web she was unraveling. As she helped guide the crowd to maintain order, Miss Marple's eyes settled once more on the chessboard bishop still in the young man's grasp. Its scratches, its placement, and its timing all pointed toward a plan far more intricate than anyone yet understood. With the sun dipping lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the cobblestones, Miss Marple realized that the game had truly begun. And in Hatherley, every observer, every whisper, and every hesitant step would serve a purpose. Some to deceive, others to reveal. Stay close, listener, for the pieces are moving, and soon a revelation will tip the board in a way no one yet suspects. The afternoon air had a crispness that hinted at the coming autumn as Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage. The stone path was lined with fallen leaves, crunching softly beneath her sensible shoes. She had received a note, written in a careful, unfamiliar hand, requesting her presence. "Your insight may prevent further misfortune," it had read, leaving her curiosity piqued. Upon arrival, she was greeted by Vicar Hammond himself, a tall, thin man whose clerical collar seemed to accentuate the lines of worry etched across his face. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, ushering her inside. "Thank you for coming so promptly. I confess, I do not know whom I can fully trust regarding these matters." "Do not concern yourself, Reverend," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle but pointed. "Trust is earned, and observation often reveals more than words alone." She allowed her eyes to wander over the vicarage sitting room, the polished oak table, the embroidered cushions, and the chessboard set up near the window, as if waiting for someone to make the next move. "Please sit," the vicar urged. "I've had visitors this morning, some who seemed merely curious, others whose motives were, I fear, less innocent." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Curiosity is often a mask, Reverend, but masks can slip with the faintest provocation." Just then, Mrs. Aldridge entered, her face flushed, carrying a small parcel. "I thought you should see this," she said breathlessly, placing it on the table. Inside was a torn page from an old ledger, listing names and amounts, some marked with small, almost imperceptible symbols. "Do you know what this is?" the vicar asked, furrowing his brow. "I believe it relates to the merchant's estate," Miss Marple said softly, studying the page. "But there is more here than simple accounts. These marks suggest a code, perhaps a warning or an accusation." Mrs. Aldridge looked unsettled. "Do you think someone intends harm?" Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet nod. "Intent is often revealed in subtle ways. The timing of your visit, the choice of this room, and the way this ledger came into your hands each speak of someone wishing to be noticed and yet remaining concealed." The vicar sighed, running a hand through his thin hair. "This village has been too peaceful for too long. Perhaps we did not notice the tensions lying just beneath the surface." Miss Marple leaned closer to the ledger, her finger tracing the symbols. "There is a pattern," she murmured. "Notice how these marks cluster around certain names but leave others untouched. Someone is signaling someone who believes they are clever enough to hide their message in plain sight. Outside, the wind rustled the leaves in the garden, a sound that seemed to underscore the weight of the conversation. Suddenly, a knock at the door startled them. A young maid entered, looking flustered. "Beg pardon, ma'am." Reverend Two saw Mr. Clark near the gate. He seemed agitated. He spoke to no one, then hurried away. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Agitation often accompanies concealment, and hasty departures are frequently as telling as lingering stays. We must be attentive to both, Reverend, for each action leaves a trace. The vicar hesitated. "Do you think he is involved?" "Not necessarily," she said with a small smile. "But he, like all of us, is part of the puzzle, and every piece, however ordinary it seems, has a place to fill in the larger picture." A soft tapping at the window drew Miss Marple's attention. She glanced outside, noting the shadow of a figure disappearing around the corner of the vicarage. Her mind catalogued the possibilities of a secret meeting, a warning, or perhaps the subtle orchestration of another layer in this intricate game. Mrs. Aldridge wrung her hands nervously. "These ledger marks frighten me. Should we show them to the authorities?" Miss Marple considered for a moment. Authority is useful when one seeks evidence, but observation often precedes action. Sometimes revealing too soon can scatter the very threads we need to follow. She stood, smoothing her dress. We must continue to watch, to listen, and to note. People reveal their truths in fleeting moments, often when they believe no one is paying attention. Vicar Hammond nodded, still visibly tense. "And you believe someone is orchestrating these events deliberately?" "I do," she replied quietly. "But the mind that plots is rarely unwise enough to act without care. That gives us the advantage, Reverend. Patience, observation, and awareness will uncover the instigator." As she prepared to leave, Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the chessboard near the window. Its pieces seemed almost to tremble in the late afternoon light. Every move had meaning, every absence was deliberate, and she, like a careful player, would wait until the moment was right to call the next piece into action. Walking down the garden path, she murmured to herself, "The game is growing ever more intricate, and in Hatherley, no gesture, no glance, and no word is without significance." Outside, the wind carried a whisper of warning or perhaps invitation. Miss Marple knew that before the day's end, more secrets would surface, and another move would be made. The village tea-room was unusually busy that morning, a gentle hum of conversation filling the air as Miss Marple entered. The smell of freshly baked scones mingled with the aroma of brewing tea, but beneath the cheerful clatter, there was a current of tension that she could feel immediately. Villagers glanced nervously at one another, their polite smiles failing to reach anxious eyes. Miss Marple took her usual corner seat near the window, where she could observe the room without drawing attention. Her gaze swept across familiar faces. Mrs. Tilling, the florist, fussing over her hat. Mr. Broadbent, the local grocer, speaking in lowered tones to a young clerk and a newcomer, a sharply dressed gentleman whose eyes flitted about as if expecting a secret to be revealed at any moment. "Good morning, Miss Marple," called Mrs. Tilling, approached with a cup of tea in hand. "Did you hear about the latest from the vicarage?" Everyone is in a flutter. "I heard a few things," Miss Marple replied softly, taking the cup. "But it seems that whispers travel faster than facts these days." Across the room, the sharply dressed gentleman caught her eye and, after a moment's hesitation, made his way to a table near the counter. He spoke quietly to a young woman seated there, handing her a small envelope before slipping out through the door with a hurried nod. Miss Marple's eyes followed the movement. A secret exchange, she noted, though of what nature she could not yet discern. Mrs. Tilling leaned closer, lowering her voice. "It seems someone has been rifling through old letters at the merchant's house. People are saying, well, it's shocking, Miss Marple. There are questions about the late Mr. Clark's testament. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. And what questions, precisely? Who is to inherit certain sums, apparently? And some say that strange symbols were found among the documents, Mrs. Tilling whispered, glancing around nervously. Like a code of sorts. Codes, Miss Marple murmured, her fingers lightly, tapping the saucer, are not always what they seem. Often it is the smallest detail overlooked that leads to the truth. At that moment, Mr. Broadbent called out across the room. "Miss Marple, if you have a moment, there is something I should mention." His expression was unusually grave, and she could sense the hesitation in his voice. "Of course, Mr. Broadbent," she said, rising and following him to a quieter corner. He lowered his voice. "It concerns a visitor to the village yesterday, one who asked rather pointed questions about the merchant's estate. They were polite enough, but the way they lingered over certain names gave me pause. I thought you might wish to know." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Thank you. Details, Mr. Broadbent, often speak louder than declarations. Every question asked, every hesitation, and every glance can reveal intentions far greater than a casual remark." Returning to her seat, she noticed the young woman from earlier now speaking with Mrs. Aldridge. Their conversation was hushed, punctuated by nervous glances toward the entrance. Miss Marple's mind catalogued the gestures, hands pressed tightly together, a bite of the lip, and the almost imperceptible shaking of a shoulder. Anxiety, perhaps, but about what? As she pondered, the tea-room door opened again, admitting a fresh gust of wind and a small commotion. Mr. Clark's assistant, a tall, earnest man, rushed in, waving a sheet of paper. "You must see this," he exclaimed, breathless. "A note was left on the chessboard yesterday with words written that I cannot make sense of." Miss Marple's eyes lit with interest. "May I see it?" she asked, holding out her hand. The young man handed it over with a trembling grip. The note was brief, the handwriting jagged. "The Queen's shadow falls where the bishop cannot reach." She read it twice, then set it down carefully. "Curious," she murmured. "A warning, perhaps, or a clue meant to confound. The choice of words is deliberate, and whoever wrote it believes they are clever enough to mislead, though all language carries its telltale signature." Mrs. Tilling leaned closer, whispering urgently. "Do you think it could mean something to the vicarage?" "Possibly," Miss Marple said softly. "Or possibly to someone else entirely. But notice the phrasing. The writer is speaking in terms of chess moves, positions, and strategy. There is meaning here for those who understand the game and danger for those who do not." The young woman glanced nervously at the note, then at Miss Marple. "Do you think it is a threat?" Miss Marple's expression remained calm, yet her mind was alert. A threat can be veiled in many forms, often cloaked in apparent riddles, and riddles, when given to the observant, reveal far more than they conceal. The room had grown quieter, the initial chatter now replaced with an undercurrent of curiosity and unease. Villagers were watching one another, sensing that something more was unfolding than mere gossip. As Miss Marple sipped her tea once more, her eyes scanned the room, noting the subtle shifts in posture, the avoidance of certain gazes, and the small, nervous gestures that betrayed concern. Every reaction was a piece of the puzzle, and slowly, carefully, she was beginning to see the pattern emerge. The tea-room, once a place of comfort and routine, had become a stage on which the first acts of a complex game were unfolding, and Miss Marple was determined to read every move before the final checkmate. The village library was quieter than usual, the usual rustle of turning pages replaced by a tense hush. Miss Marple moved between the tall oak shelves with measured steps, her gaze lingering on the stacks where dusty ledgers and old manuscripts lay in neat rows. She had come to consult records that might shed light on the cryptic note from the tea-room, yet it was the behavior of those around her that caught her attention first. At a corner table, the sharply dressed gentleman from the tea-room whispered hurriedly to the young woman, whose hand trembled as she clutched a small book. Their eyes darted repeatedly toward the librarian, a stern woman who clearly disapproved of any disturbance. Miss Marple's lips pressed together in thought. Anxiety, secrecy, and the careful concealment of intent. These were the markers of someone hiding more than they wished to reveal. "Miss Marple." The librarian's voice broke the stillness, startling a nearby patron. "You have come about the Clark estate, I presume?" "Indeed," Miss Marple replied calmly, selecting a ledger from a nearby shelf. "I was hoping to examine the records of past transactions. It appears that there are details in writing that may have been overlooked." The librarian adjusted her spectacles, peering at Miss Marple with an air of mild suspicion. "Many people have been inquiring about those records of late. I would caution you to be discreet. There are tensions brewing regarding the testament." Miss Marple inclined her head. Tensions often speak louder than words. She opened the ledger carefully, scanning columns of names, dates, and amounts. A curious entry caught her eye. A transfer of funds to an account under an unfamiliar name, dated just weeks before Mr. Clark's passing. "Ah," she murmured under her breath. The timing seemed peculiar, too neat to be coincidental. From the corner of her eye, she noticed the young woman approaching cautiously, clutching the small book as if it were a shield. "Excuse me, Miss Marple," she said, voice trembling slightly. "I couldn't help overhearing. Perhaps you could help me understand something. There's a record here that seems unusual." Miss Marple gestured to the seat across from her. "Please sit. Let us examine it together." The young woman laid the book open. Inside were pages of handwritten notes with chess pieces sketched along the margins with cryptic annotations. Miss Marple's brow arched slightly. "Ah, the chess references," she said softly. The note in the tea room was not idle. Whoever wrote this is speaking in a language of strategy and foresight. She studied the patterns of movement noted beside each piece. A queen advancing boldly, a bishop restricted, pawns sacrificed. "There is a sequence here," Miss Marple observed, intended to convey information to those who understand both the game and its symbolism, and yet the handwriting is hurried, almost anxious, as if someone feared being discovered. The young woman bit her lip. "I believe I may have stumbled upon something important. I was just trying to understand the ledger entries when I noticed these annotations. I didn't know who else to trust." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "Trust is built carefully, miss." "Harper," the young woman said quietly. "Evelyn Harper." Miss Marple nodded, making a mental note. "Evelyn, we must tread carefully. Secrets, when revealed too hastily, can be dangerous. And yet, this discovery may prove crucial to understanding what has been happening in the village." Across the library, the sharply dressed gentleman paused mid-step, appearing to reconsider his movements. He glanced toward Miss Marple, then quickly turned away, slipping behind a shelf as if to avoid notice. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the subtle hesitation and instinctive response, guilt or fear. She could not yet determine which. "I'm afraid I don't understand half of this," Evelyn said, her voice tinged with worry. "The chess references, the ledger, what does it all mean?" Miss Marple closed the ledger gently. "The meaning will reveal itself, piece by piece, as we observe the actions of those involved. The smallest gestures, Evelyn, often hold the key to understanding larger schemes. Notice who lingers, who avoids, and who seems compelled to speak at just the wrong moment." Just then, the librarian cleared her throat, moving between the shelves. "I must remind everyone to maintain order. Some of the records are sensitive. Carelessness could cause scandal." Her eyes flicked toward the sharply dressed gentleman's hiding spot, and he disappeared entirely, as if the floor had swallowed him. Miss Marple gave a slight, knowing smile. "Indeed," she murmured. scandals do not always announce themselves loudly. Often they grow quietly, fed by fear and secrecy, and it is the observant who will see their unfolding before anyone else. As she returned her attention to the ledger and Evelyn's book, a shadow crossed the floor, briefly covering the notes with a cold chill. Miss Marple looked up, her eyes narrowing. Someone else had entered the library, moving deliberately between the stacks, hands partially concealed. She felt the first prickling sense of immediate danger. Not violence yet, but intent. Evelyn shivered. "Miss Marple, should we?" "Patience," Miss Marple replied gently, her voice calm but firm. "Observe. Every move, every glance, every hesitation is part of the story, and sometimes the most revealing moments happen when the players believe no one is watching." The newcomer paused near a shelf, glancing over his shoulder. Miss Marple recognized the telltale signs: eyes flickering, lips pressed together, and hands twitching ever so slightly. A secret, carefully guarded, yet almost imperceptibly betrayed by nervousness. The library, once a haven of quiet reflection, had become a stage of suspicion, with Miss Marple silently orchestrating her observations, ready to catch the next revealing gesture that would bring the puzzle closer to its center. And in that silent, tension-filled room, the first pieces of a larger strategy were beginning to fall into place. The afternoon sun slanted through the lace curtains of the Harper residence, casting delicate shadows that danced across the polished wooden floor. Miss Marple had accepted Evelyn's invitation to the house, under the pretense of examining more of the young woman's notes. Yet even before stepping inside, she felt the subtle tension hanging in the air, the unspoken urgency that accompanies secrets. "Thank you for seeing me." "Miss Marple," Evelyn said, her voice quieter than usual. "I didn't want to tell anyone else." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "You have done well to bring this to me, Evelyn. But remember, revealing too much at once can be as dangerous as revealing nothing at all." She surveyed the sitting room, noting the careful arrangement of furniture and the way the curtains were drawn slightly tighter than necessary. A nervous household, she mused, often betrays its anxiety in small, almost trivial ways. Evelyn led her to a small writing desk in the corner, cluttered with ledgers, sketches, and loose sheets of paper. "I've tried to make sense of the annotations," she explained. "There's something about the movements, the timing. It feels like a code." Miss Marple leaned forward, her gaze tracing the delicate, hurried script. "Chess is a language of strategy and intention, Evelyn. The writer reveals not merely moves on a board, but the thinking behind them, and often the thinking betrays emotion more than logic." Before Evelyn could respond, a faint noise drifted from the next room, the rustle of fabric, followed by the soft murmur of a voice. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Someone is there," she said gently, "and they believe they are unobserved." Evelyn glanced toward the source of the sound, her expression tense. "That would be my cousin, Harold. He's been uneasy ever since the note appeared in the tea room." Miss Marple nodded, her mind already piecing together the behaviors she had observed over the past days. Harold's nervous glances, his sudden absences, and the way he lingered on the threshold of conversations without speaking are all subtle but now making a coherent pattern. As if on cue, Harold entered the sitting room, his face flushed and his hands fidgeting with the edge of a cuff. "Miss Marple," he said stiffly. "I wasn't eavesdropping. I merely came to check on Evelyn. She's been agitated." "Of course," Miss Marple replied calmly, her voice lilting with gentle curiosity. "And yet, agitation often speaks in volumes louder than words. What is it you wish to protect, Harold? And from whom?" Harold stiffened, caught off guard by her directness. He opened his mouth, hesitated, then spoke haltingly. "I don't know what you mean." Evelyn glanced at Miss Marple with a mixture of relief and fear. "He's been insisting on keeping certain letters from the Clark estate hidden. He claims it's for my own good." Miss Marple's eyes flicked to Harold, noting the subtle shift in his posture, the tightening of the jaw, and the avoidance of her gaze. "For your own good, or for his own protection?" she asked softly. Harold's face paled slightly, and he turned toward the window, as if hoping the sunlight would provide a shield. "I merely want to ensure no misunderstandings arise," he said evasively. Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint, knowing smile. "Misunderstandings, Harold, are the currency of those who wish to conceal the truth. And yet, one day, the truth has a way of revealing itself." Evelyn shivered, clutching her notes. "Do you think someone has been watching the library?" The ledger, the annotations, and the people who were there didn't seem like ordinary villagers. "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "And someone has been more careful in observing others than others have been in observing him. Fear can sharpen one's senses, but it can also betray a hand too soon." There was a pause, broken only by the faint tick of a mantel clock. Then, a sharp sound from the hall. A knock, quick and deliberate, caused all three to glance toward the door. Evelyn's hand trembled slightly as she stepped forward, while Miss Marple remained perfectly composed, noting every detail: the slight scrape of the wood beneath the knock, the pause before the next sound, and the deliberate slowness, as if the visitor wished to be recognized yet not welcomed. When the door opened, a tall man in a dark coat appeared, his expression unreadable, and his gaze immediately sought Evelyn's. "Miss Harper," he said formally, "I believe we need to speak about certain documents from your cousin's collection." Harold's eyes narrowed. "This is an intrusion. You have no right." Miss Marple raised a hand, her calm authority slicing through the rising tension. "Patience. Every move will be revealed in due course. Let us observe, Evelyn. Sometimes the presence of a new figure exposes more than any interrogation ever could." The man stepped inside, carefully maintaining a polite distance. Every motion, every glance, even the precise way he set his hat on the table, Miss Marple noted with keen interest. There was purpose behind his politeness, a hidden urgency, a secret that weighed heavier than the surface composure suggested. Evelyn, white-faced and quiet, whispered, "Who is he?" Someone whose arrival was expected, yet not fully anticipated. Miss Marple replied softly, her eyes never leaving the man's subtle gestures. And in the next moments, Evelyn, we may glimpse the first cracks in a carefully constructed facade. The room seemed to hold its breath. Outside, the sun dipped lower, lengthening shadows across the floor, and Miss Marple sensed that the next revelation, however small, would tilt the balance toward the truth. The evening air was heavy with a sense of expectancy as Miss Marple and Evelyn retreated to the smaller back room of the Harper house. The man in the dark coat had taken a seat near the window, his eyes wandering over every piece of furniture, every decorative detail, as if searching for a hidden meaning behind the ordinary. Miss Marple, however, paid closer attention to Evelyn's reactions, subtle changes in posture, quick glances, and the faintest tightening of her hands around the notes she carried. "Miss Marple," Evelyn whispered. He seemed to know things. About the ledger, about Harold. And yet he asked questions as if he were guessing. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with quiet amusement. People who know less than they appear to know often speak with the certainty of those who know far too much. One should watch not the questions they ask, but the hesitation that precedes the question. The man cleared his throat, breaking the delicate tension. "Miss Harper, it has come to my attention that your cousin has been keeping documents that are of considerable interest. I trust they are safe." Evelyn's voice wavered. "I thought they were, yes. Harold insisted on keeping them locked, but I only saw a portion of what was written. Some of it is difficult to understand." "And yet," Miss Marple interjected gently, "difficulty is often a shield for fear. Fear of exposure, fear of accusation, or perhaps fear of one's own conscience." She allowed a slight pause, letting the observation settle in the room. The man's gaze shifted to her, sharp and calculating. "You have a way of perceiving more than you let on, miss." "Marple," she supplied. "I notice small things. The world tends to reveal itself to those who observe quietly, rather than speak loudly." Harold, who had been standing near the door, shifted uncomfortably. His hands fidgeted with the buttons of his waistcoat. "Miss Marple," he said, voice tight, "perhaps you are reading too much into harmless documents. They are only ledgers, notes, and things that belonged to my uncle." Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her tone was firm. "Harold, one's notion of harmlessness is not always shared by those who watch and wait, and those who write in careful code often intend to conceal truths that are anything but trivial." The visitor leaned slightly forward. "Miss Marple, I must insist that we examine the ledger together. There are entries that may clarify recent disturbances. Your cousin's discretion, while commendable, has perhaps delayed necessary action." Evelyn hesitated, torn between loyalty to her cousin and a sense that cooperation might uncover something crucial. "Very well," she said at last, "but I warn you, some of it may be meaningless, or perhaps misleading." Miss Marple nodded approvingly. "And yet meaning is often hidden in what appears misleading. That is why we watch closely, and we listen carefully." As they approached the ledger, Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught a detail overlooked by the others, a small crease at the edge of one page, suggesting it had been turned frequently, almost as if signaling importance. Her fingers hovered over it, but she made no move to open it immediately. Instead, she observed the reactions of the two men. The visitor's eyes flickered briefly to the crease, then away, while Harold's fingers tightened around his own notes. That small gesture spoke volumes, more than the formalities of words ever could. "Have you guessed yet who is hiding what, dear listener?" Miss Marple's voice might have been a soft murmur, but in her mind it was a question to anyone following the story. Every hesitation, every glance, every slip of composure had its weight. Harold shifted again, and the visitor cleared his throat, placing a gloved hand over a portion of the ledger as if to mark territory. Miss Marple's intuition prickled. This was a moment where secrecy would clash with curiosity, where a small act might reveal intentions far deeper than any confession. Evelyn, sensing the tension, whispered, "Miss Marple, what shall we do?" "Observe," she replied softly. "We must see who is anxious, who is casual, and who is deliberate. Often the culprit is revealed not in action, but in restraint." The room was quiet, save for the faint scratching of a pen, as Evelyn began noting entries. The man's fingers hovered over certain pages, retracting only when Miss Marple's eyes met his. Harold's foot tapped an irregular rhythm against the floor, betraying impatience that his face denied. Miss Marple allowed a slow, deliberate pause before speaking. "Sometimes the ledger tells more than its words. Look at the interactions, the timing, the hesitation, and the eagerness. All these small movements form a pattern far clearer than any single entry." Outside, dusk settled over the village. The shadows deepened, falling across the room like silent observers. And in that dim light, Miss Marple noted a final, telling detail of a faint smudge on Harold's sleeve, unnoticed by anyone else, yet hinting at recent contact with something or someone that should have remained untouched. The stage was set, and Miss Marple, ever patient, understood that the next revelation, however small, would bring them closer to the truth. A truth hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to emerge. The next morning, the Harper drawing room was bathed in pale sunlight that did little to warm the tense atmosphere. Miss Marple had insisted that all concerned parties assemble, and by 10 o'clock the room was filled with a careful mixture of curiosity and unease. Evelyn stood near the window, hands clasped, glancing between the men who had arrived, each carrying a weight of expectation. Miss Marple moved gently from one side of the room to the other, her eyes scanning the faces, noting the slightest twitch, the faintest flush, and the subtle hesitation in speech. Sometimes, the truth is revealed in what people believe they can hide, she murmured to herself, a remark meant more for reflection than for conversation. The visitor in the dark coat spoke first. "Miss Marple, you wished for this meeting. Shall we proceed with the ledger?" "I believe it is more prudent to speak first," Miss Marple replied, her tone calm yet commanding. "Documents can mislead, but the person who wields them is rarely so careful." She gestured toward Harold, whose face was a careful mask of neutrality. "Harold, perhaps you can tell us who has had access to your uncle's papers, aside from yourself." Harold hesitated, glancing toward Evelyn, who nodded ever so slightly. "Only Evelyn and I," he admitted, his voice even but his fingers drumming lightly on the table. "No one else touched them." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed in thought. "And yet, we have reason to believe that some entries have been noted, some erased and some altered." She let the words hang, watching carefully. The visitor leaned forward, voice sharp. "Are you suggesting that someone has interfered with the ledger?" "I am merely observing the evidence of human behavior," Miss Marple replied. "One can often detect more from hesitation, from avoidance, than from confession." She glanced toward Evelyn, who seemed to shrink slightly under her gaze. "I didn't mean to," Evelyn began. But Miss Marple raised a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "Not yet," she said softly, almost kindly. "We must first understand the pattern, who enters, who leaves, and what remains hidden in plain sight. Sometimes the smallest gesture speaks louder than words." The tension thickened as the visitor's eyes darted between Harold and Evelyn. "Are we to wait for these subtle revelations, Miss Marple, or shall we examine the ledger?" "The ledger will speak," she said, "but it will speak most clearly when everyone is present and observed. And today, everyone is here." She gestured to the assembled group, including a few local villagers Miss Marple had invited, each curious, each unknowingly a witness to human nature at its most revealing. Harold shifted uncomfortably. "I don't see how a few villagers can contribute anything of importance," he said, voice tight. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "They will not speak, Harold. They will simply watch. And in watching, we often discover who cannot bear to remain still and who cannot keep a secret, even when their lips are sealed." A hush fell over the room as she continued. "Now, let us recount the events of the past weeks. The missing document, the alterations to the ledger, and the suspicious inquiries will be recounted, and we shall watch the reactions carefully." She paused, letting the suspense build. The visitor in the dark coat cleared his throat, and for a brief moment the room seemed to hold its collective breath. Miss Marple's gaze settled on him, noting the way his hand trembled slightly as he adjusted his cuff. "Even the most confident demeanor can falter under observation," she said softly. Evelyn's hands were clasped tightly, knuckles white. "Miss Marple," she whispered, "I am afraid someone will be blamed unfairly." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Fear is a useful guide, my dear, for it often reveals who has reason to be afraid. And in that revelation, we edge closer to the truth." Harold's foot tapped nervously, a rhythm that seemed almost to echo across the quiet room. Miss Marple made no note of it aloud, but her mind catalogued every detail. The ledger remained closed on the table, a silent witness to the tension swirling around it. Then she spoke again, her voice steady and calm. "There is a pattern here, a thread that runs through hesitation, overstatement, and avoidance, and it is that thread that will lead us to the person responsible." A sudden creak of the floorboard drew all eyes toward the door. Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint, knowing smile. "Patience, everyone. The next step must be careful, and when it comes, It will not be the documents that reveal the truth, but the actions of those who wish to conceal it." The room fell silent, save for the soft rustling of clothing and the occasional clearing of a throat. Miss Marple's eyes swept over the assembled group one final time. Every nervous glance, every tiny movement, and every subtle hesitation was noted and stored in her mind. And outside, the late morning sun shone indifferently, casting shadows that mirrored the uncertainty within. In those shadows, the final threads of deception waited to be untangled, and Miss Marple knew that the revelation, when it came, would be both unexpected and inevitable. The Harper drawing-room remained thick with anticipation, each occupant aware that Miss Marple was quietly orchestrating an unraveling of truths. Conversations were hushed, punctuated by careful glances and restrained gestures, as if the very air had learned to keep secrets. Miss Marple, seated near the hearth, fingered a knitting needle idly, but observed everything. The flick of an eye, the twitch of a lip, and the tension in a clenched hand. Evelyn shifted in her chair, lowering her gaze. "I still cannot believe Uncle Philip's ledger could cause such turmoil," she murmured, almost to herself. "Ah, my dear, it is rarely the document itself that matters," Miss Marple replied softly. "It is what it represents, and more importantly, who wishes to hide from it." Across the room, Harold's hand hovered near a stack of papers as though drawn by an invisible magnet, then recoiled. "Miss Marple, surely all this speculation is unnecessary." If the ledger was simply mislaid, Miss Marple's gaze lifted, sharp as a hawk's. "Mislaid, Harold? Or perhaps deliberately set aside for someone's convenience? You see, it is not the misplacement that matters, but the motivation behind it." The visitor in the dark coat shifted uneasily. "Do you think someone here would actually tamper with it?" he asked, a slight edge of suspicion creeping into his voice. "I do not think. I observe," Miss Marple said, her voice calm yet precise. "And observation reveals that hesitation and over-explanation are rarely innocent." She turned slightly toward Evelyn, who visibly stiffened, clutching the folds of her skirt. A soft cough interrupted the tension, coming from Mrs. Penfold, the Harpers' housekeeper. "Begging your pardon, Miss Marple, but I did notice something odd the other evening." Mr. Harold returned from the study quite late, yet the door was locked behind him. "I thought nothing of it at the time." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled ever so slightly. "Thank you, Mrs. Penfold. Even small observations can illuminate larger truths." She let the remark linger as she watched Harold stiffen, a faint pink creeping along his neck. Harold attempted to regain composure. "I was merely ensuring the ledger's safety. It is hardly a secret that I took precautions." Miss Marple nodded, as though considering the claim carefully. "Indeed. But sometimes the safest place to hide something is precisely where no one thinks to look. And those who claim diligence most loudly are often the ones with the most to conceal." A tense silence fell over the room, punctuated only by the ticking of the ornate grandfather clock in the corner. Then Evelyn spoke, her voice quivering slightly. "Do you truly believe someone here meant to harm? Intent is often revealed in details overlooked by the anxious mind," Miss Marple said quietly. "Tell me, have you noticed any discrepancies in behavior over the past days?" A ripple of unease passed through the group. The visitor in the dark coat shifted in his seat, a barely perceptible glance toward Harold. "I suppose there have been unusual comings and goings," he admitted, his tone cautious. "And what precisely did you notice?" Miss Marple asked, her voice gentle but firm, drawing every eye in the room. "Well, Mr. Harold," the visitor began, then paused, clearly weighing his words. He seemed unusually tense when the subject of Uncle Philip's will came up, and he often lingered near the study, even when no one asked him to. Evelyn's eyes widened, and she exchanged a fleeting glance with Harold, who now appeared pale, his composure faltering. "That is merely coincidence," Harold interjected, voice a touch sharp. Miss Marple's fingers tapped lightly on her knitting. Coincidence does not explain repeated patterns, my dear. Nor does it account for subtle inconsistencies. For instance, Harold, you claim to have read the ledger every evening, yet witnesses noted you absent at critical times. How might that be reconciled? Harold's jaw tightened and his hand fidgeted with the cuff of his sleeve. I had other responsibilities, he said, voice strained. Miss Marple inclined her head, a quiet smile playing on her lips. Ah, yes, other responsibilities. And yet, Mrs. Penfold noted that you returned late on that particular evening, and the ledger, conveniently, showed a newly altered entry the following morning. It is in these moments, Harold, that the truth often hides in plain sight. Evelyn's lips parted, a soft gasp escaping as realization flickered across her face. The visitor leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Are you suggesting Harold tampered with the ledger? Miss Marple's gaze swept the room once more, calm yet commanding. I suggest we observe further, listen carefully, and note every small gesture. For the person who believes themselves cleverest is often the most revealing under the patient eye of scrutiny. A sudden knock at the door startled everyone. Miss Marple did not flinch. Come in, she said, her voice steady. The door creaked open, revealing a messenger with a small note. Miss Marple took the note, eyes scanning the words. Her lips curved in a subtle, knowing smile. It appears the next clue has arrived, she said, raising her head to meet the room's tense gaze. And it may well change everything we think we know. The room fell silent once again, but the air now thrummed with anticipation, each person aware that the truth was drawing nearer, yet cloaked in the shadows of uncertainty and concealed intentions. The morning sun filtered softly through the lace curtains of the Harper study, casting delicate patterns across the polished wood. Miss Marple stood near the tall bookshelf, her eyes tracing the faint scratches on the floor, noting how they led toward the locked cabinet where Uncle Philip's ledger had been kept. The house seemed quieter than usual, each creak and whisper of the wind magnified, as if the very walls held their breath in anticipation. Evelyn hovered by the doorway, her fingers nervously twisting the edge of her shawl. Miss Marple, do you think the note from last night truly means something? Indeed, my dear, Miss Marple replied, her tone light but her gaze unwavering. Notes are often messengers of truth, though sometimes they carry a hint of misdirection. It is the intent behind them that matters. Harold, standing stiffly near the fireplace, cleared his throat. I still fail to see why such attention is being paid to trivial scribbles. It is merely an old ledger after all. Miss Marple's eyes flicked toward him, subtle yet incisive. Triviality is rarely the concern of those who know what to look for, and you, Harold, appear remarkably interested in downplaying its importance, do you not? Harold's lips pressed tightly, together, and he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. I'm simply practical, he replied, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint, knowing smile. Practicality, yes. But sometimes practicality masks anxiety, and anxiety can betray a secret one wishes to conceal. Evelyn stepped closer, whispering, Do you truly suspect someone here would deceive us? Miss Marple's gaze softened for a moment, yet there remained an edge to her expression. Deception is rarely a grand performance, my dear. It is small slips, subtle gestures, and inconsistent statements that reveal the truth. Observe carefully, and you will see who falters. The study door creaked, and Mrs. Penfold entered, holding a delicate silver tray with 2 cups of tea. She glanced nervously at Harold. I thought you might like some refreshment while you work, she said, placing the tray down. Her eyes lingered on him for a fraction too long. Harold's hand trembled slightly as he reached for a cup, and Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the motion instantly. An unsteady hand, she murmured to herself, often betrays more than words ever could. As tea was poured and small clinks of porcelain echoed through the room, Miss Marple picked up the note that had arrived the previous evening. The paper was folded with care, yet the handwriting seemed hurried, almost hesitant. She traced the words with a delicate finger. "Seek where the shadow falls, and the truth shall reveal itself," she read aloud softly. A curious clue, indeed. One must consider who wrote it and why they chose these words. Shadows, after all, exist only where light is partially obstructed. Evelyn frowned. "Do you think it refers to a specific place in the house?" Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Most likely. And in my experience, when a message is so carefully worded, it often points to something overlooked, something hidden in plain sight. The ledger, while significant, is not the only object of interest." Harold's sudden cough broke the momentary quiet. He glanced nervously at Miss Marple. "I don't understand why you make such a fuss over poetry and shadows. Surely these are merely metaphors." Miss Marple's eyes met his, steady and unyielding. "Metaphors, perhaps, or a very literal instruction. One must always consider both possibilities, Harold, for truth has a way of hiding in the spaces between." The visitor in the dark coat, who had been silently observing from the corner, finally spoke. "Miss Marple, are you suggesting someone here left the note intentionally for us to find?" "I'm suggesting that someone wishes a particular truth to come to light," Miss Marple replied. "Whether it is to warn, to manipulate, or to conceal further, we shall soon discern. And those who underestimate small clues often find themselves most exposed." A faint creak on the floorboards drew everyone's attention. Miss Marple turned her head slowly. "Ah, it seems we have another observer," she said, a subtle hint of amusement in her voice. "Or perhaps someone who believes they're clever enough to remain unnoticed. Either way, their movements may speak more than words." Evelyn's breath caught. Could it be another message? Another warning? Miss Marple shook her head slightly. "Not a message, my dear. A gesture. One that, if noted carefully, can reveal motive, fear, or guilt. And in the coming hours, we shall see which of these applies." The group fell silent again, each person acutely aware of the other's presence. Shadows danced lightly across the walls as sunlight shifted through the curtains. Miss Marple's gaze swept over the room, capturing every subtle reaction, every twitch and hesitation, and storing each detail quietly in her mind. Finally, she spoke, her voice calm yet imbued with quiet authority. "We have a new puzzle to solve, and it begins not with grand gestures, but with the smallest of observations. Let us see who among us cannot resist revealing more than they intend." Harold's eyes flickered nervously toward the ledger, then away. Evelyn's hands clutched her shawl, fingers tightening involuntarily. And in that moment, Miss Marple knew that the shadow of truth was about to fall upon them all, revealing secrets previously thought safely hidden. The drawing-room of Fairborough Manor was unusually tense that evening. Candles flickered in tall silver holders, casting dancing shadows on the walls, while a nervous hush settled over the assembled guests. Miss Marple, seated calmly by the window, her knitting forgotten on her lap, observed every twitch and glance, every subtle shift in posture. She allowed the silence to stretch, letting it press upon the room, knowing the tension would soon force the truth into the open. Colonel Ridley shifted uneasily in his chair, glancing repeatedly at the grandfather clock, as though its steady ticking mocked him. Miss Marple's sharp eyes noted the colonel's fingers drumming a nervous rhythm on the arm of his chair, a rhythm so controlled yet revealing of inner agitation. Beside him, Mrs. Cartwright clutched her fan tightly, betraying a tension that her composed exterior tried vainly to mask. "Shall we begin?" Miss Marple's voice broke the silence, gentle yet carrying an authority that made everyone still. She rose slowly, walking toward the center of the room, her movements deliberate, almost theatrical. I believe it is time to piece together the curious puzzle that has disturbed our quiet village these past weeks. No one spoke. All eyes were fixed on her. The flicker of candlelight caught in the eyes of each guest, illuminating fleeting expressions of guilt, fear, and uncertainty. Miss Marple paused, allowing each glance and twitch to register, silently cataloguing behavior like a librarian noting the precise placement of volumes on a shelf. "Let us consider the events in order," she began, her tone conversational but firm. "Mr. Ellsworth's arrival in Fairborough, the peculiar testament he left behind, and the tragic discovery in the garden. Each event is a thread, and together they form a tapestry revealing more than mere chance or misfortune." A faint murmur ran through the guests. Mr. Ellsworth, the lawyer, cleared his throat, attempting composure but failing to hide the slight tremor in his hands. Miss Marple's eyes softened momentarily toward him, though she never lost her penetrating focus. "Mr. Ellsworth, you were most helpful in securing the document, yet there was one detail overlooked in a seemingly trivial remark made about the chessboard at the Manor's library." Eyes widened. Colonel Ridley's hand tightened around his armrest, and Mrs. Cartwright's fan quivered. Miss Marple's gaze swept across the room, catching the slightest flinch from every guest. She smiled faintly, almost kindly. It is the small, unnoticed details, after all, that reveal the heart of human intention. She lifted her knitting needle, pointing gently toward the chessboard displayed at the far end of the room. Notice the arrangement of the pieces. At first glance, it seems random, yet there is a deliberate order signature, if you will. Someone sought to communicate without words, and in doing so, revealed more than they intended. The silence was suffocating, each guest hanging on her words. The chessboard was not merely a game, nor a mere distraction. It was a cipher, a guide to the testament's true executor, and only one of you had both the knowledge and the opportunity to manipulate it so precisely. A sharp intake of breath came from Colonel Ridley. His usual bravado faltered as Miss Marple's gaze settled directly on him. "Colonel, your familiarity with cryptic puzzles is well known, as is your impatience with those who might hinder your ambitions. Yet it was a slippery reference to the bishop's diagonal movement that betrayed you." The colonel's face paled, his composure crumbling. He opened his mouth, attempted a denial, but words faltered under the weight of Miss Marple's observations. I only wished I did not intend his voice trailed into a nervous whisper. "Intentions matter little when actions betray them," Miss Marple said softly. She gestured to the small group of servants who had been quietly observing from the doorway. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson and Mr. Harris. Your vigilance and the subtle reports of unusual behavior were invaluable. Every fleeting glance, every hushed remark contributed to unveiling the truth." Colonel Ridley's shoulders slumped, the mask of dignity fully stripped away. "I see now it was foolish on the chessboard." He shook his head, the confession barely forming in his own mind before the words spilled out. "I arranged the pieces, hoping to mislead to secure the inheritance. I never meant for the outcome." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Yet the outcome reveals character, Colonel. A heart driven by greed and impatience cannot conceal its true nature. You underestimated the quiet powers of observation and the patience of those who notice what others ignore." A collective sigh filled the room, a mixture of relief, shock, and lingering tension. Mrs. Cartwright dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, while Mr. Ellsworth closed the testament with a faint shake of his head. Miss Marple returned to her seat by the window, resuming her knitting with serene finality, as though the entire drama were but another stitch in the fabric of life she so keenly observed. "Let us remember," she said softly, "that even in the most tranquil of villages, the smallest gestures and the subtlest inconsistencies are enough to reveal the truth. And perhaps, a lesson for all of us to look beyond appearances and listen to the quiet whispers of human nature. The candlelight flickered once more, and the drawing-room seemed to breathe with the release of tension. Yet Miss Marple's final glance toward the chessboard carried a warning. Truth may be revealed, but human nature, in all its complexity, continues to surprise. The village of Fairborough returned slowly to its accustomed rhythm, though an undercurrent of unease lingered in the air. Shopkeepers exchanged wary glances, and the clatter of hooves on cobblestones seemed quieter somehow, as if the streets themselves were holding their breath. Miss Marple, for her part, walked through the village with her usual measured pace, noting the familiar signs of daily life resuming, yet aware that nothing quite felt the same again. At the bakery, she paused to chat with Mrs. Wilkins, whose hands were dusted with flour. "Good morning, Miss Marple. Quite the stir last night," the baker's wife said, arranging pastries on the display. "I hardly know what to think anymore." She glanced toward the window where the sun caught the frost on the panes. "It's a relief, of course. But, well, unsettling, isn't it?" Miss Marple nodded, her eyes twinkling with gentle amusement. "Indeed, Mrs. Wilkins. It is often the quietest villages where the most curious mischief can hide. People think they know their neighbors, but sometimes the smallest detail, an overlooked gesture, or a fleeting remark reveals what is truly beneath the surface." She selected a loaf of bread, her mind already cataloguing the day's conversations and the small telling signs of relief mixed with lingering suspicion on every face. As she made her way down the main street, she noticed Colonel Ridley's carriage passing in a hurried rush, the driver's eyes fixed straight ahead, avoiding the glances of passers-by. Even from a distance, Miss Marple observed the subtle signs of someone carrying embarrassment and bitterness, a visible mark of the evening's revelations. A few children watched from the curb, whispering excitedly, yet no one dared approach him. "Pride and secrecy," she murmured to herself. "They leave traces as unmistakable as footprints in the snow." Later that afternoon, she returned to Fairborough Manor, where Mr. Ellsworth was tidying papers in the study, still recovering from the strain of last night's proceedings. He looked up as Miss Marple entered, his expression softening. "Miss Marple, I can never thank you enough. Without your insight, I fear the consequences might have been far graver." He gestured toward the chessboard, now restored to its neutral arrangement. "The testament will proceed as intended, thanks to your careful observations." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her hands folded in front of her. "The testament, yes, but it is never merely about documents or inheritance. It is about the quiet truths that we often overlook, the behaviors that speak louder than words. We must watch carefully and not assume that appearances always reveal the story." Her voice carried a calm authority, a reminder of the wisdom she had quietly exercised throughout the unfolding events. Outside the study window, the garden gleamed in the afternoon sun, dew still glistening on the grass. She observed the paths where the late night's drama had taken place. Each hedge, each flower bed seemed to hold a memory, a silent witness to human folly and ambition. The air was fresh, carrying the scent of spring's early blossoms, yet the shadows of tension that had darkened the manor lingered, subtle but undeniable. Miss Marple paused to reflect on the human patterns she had observed. In every conversation, every casual remark, there were hidden meanings, slips of honesty disguised by social niceties. The villagers, the Colonel, and even Mr. Ellsworth had revealed themselves through these small signs, and it was precisely this attention to the minutiae that had allowed the truth to surface. People rarely understand themselves fully, she mused, and even less so the effect of their actions on others. By evening, the manor settled into a quiet order. Candles were lit once more, but their glow felt softer and warmer, carrying no tension, only the gentle calm of resolution. Miss Marple sat by the window, knitting again, watching shadows lengthen across the garden. She allowed herself a brief smile, not of triumph, but of quiet satisfaction. A delicate balance had been restored, yet she knew the lessons of human nature were never-ending, each day bringing new stories, new secrets, and subtle reminders of how little is ever truly as it seems. As she rose to leave, her eyes fell once more on the chessboard. The pieces stood in silent readiness, as if awaiting another challenge, another mind to discern the stories hidden within. Miss Marple's final glance was sharp yet soft, a reminder that truth was always present for those who observed carefully, but never fully predictable. In the quiet of Fairborough, life resumed, but the village would remember, in subtle ways, the night when human nature had been so fully revealed.